A reading of The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street by Rod Serling. Act 1. Fade in on a shot of the sky. The various nebulae and the planet bodies stand out in sharp, sparkling relief. As the camera begins a slow pan across the heavens. Narrator's voice. There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone. The camera has begun to pan down until it passes the horizon, and on a sign which reads Maple Street, pan down until we are shooting down at an angle toward the street below. It is a tree-lined, quiet residential American street, very typical of the small town. The houses have front porches on which people sit and swing on gliders, conversing across from house to house. Steve Brand polishes his car parked in front of his house. His neighbor, Don Martin, leans against the fender, watching him. A good-humored man rides a bicycle and is just in the process of stopping to sell some ice cream to a couple of kids. Two women gossip on the front lawn. Another man waters his lawn. Narrator's voice. Maple Street, USA, late summer. A tree-lined little world of front porch gliders, hopscotch, the laughter of children, and the bell of an ice cream vendor. There is a pause, and the camera moves over to a shot of the good-humored man and the two small boys who are standing alongside, just buying ice cream. Narrator's voice. At the sound of the roar and the flash of light, it will be precisely 6:43 p.m. on Maple Street. At this moment, one of the little boys, Tommy, looks up to listen to a sound of a tremendous screeching roar from overhead. A flash of light plays on both their faces, and then it moves down the street, past lawns and porches and rooftops, and then disappears. Various people leave their porches and stop what they're doing to stare up at the sky. Steve Brand and the man who's been polishing his car, and now he stands there transfixed, staring upwards. He looks at Don Martin, his neighbor from across the street. Steve, who was that? A meteor? Don nods. That's what it looked like. I didn't hear any crash, though, did you? Steve shakes his head. Nope. I didn't hear anything except a roar. Mrs. Brand, from her porch. Steve, who was that? Steve, raising his voice and looking toward the porch. Guess it was a meteor, honey. Came awful close, didn't it? Mrs. Brand. Too close for my money. Much too close. The camera pans across the various porches to people who stand there watching and talking in low conversing tones. Narrator's voice. Maple Street, 6:44 p.m. on a late September evening. A pause. Maple Street in the last calm and reflective moments before the monsters came. The camera slowly pans across the porch again. We see a man screwing a light bulb on a front porch, then getting down off the stool to flick the switch and finding that nothing happens. Another man is working on an electric power mower. He plugs in the plug, flicks on the switch of the power mower, off and on, with nothing happening. Through the window of a front porch, we see a woman pushing her finger back and forth on the dial hook. Her voice is indistinct and distant, but intelligible and repetitive. Woman. Operator, operator, something's wrong on the phone. Operator! Mrs. Brand comes out on the porch and calls to Steve, calling. Steve, the power's off. And I had this soup on the stove, and the stove just stopped working. Woman. Same thing over here. I can't get anybody on the phone either. The phone seems to be dead. We look down the street as we hear the voices creep up from down below. Small, mildly disturbed voices highlighting these kinds of phrases. Voices. Electricity's off. Phone won't work. Can't get a thing on the radio. My power motor won't move. Won't work at all. Radio's dead. Pete Van Horn, a tall, thin man, is seen standing in front of his house. Van Horn: I'll cut through the backyard, see if the power's still on Floral Street. Be right back. He walks past the side of his house and disappears into the backyard, the hammer on Van Horn's hip as he walks. The camera pans down slowly until we're looking at 10 or 11 people standing around the street and overflowing to the curb and sidewalk. In the background is Steve Brandt's car. Steve: doesn't make sense. Why should the power go off all of a sudden and the phone line? Don: maybe some sort of electrical storm or something. Charlie: that don't seem likely. Sky's just as blue as anything. Not a cloud, no lightning, no thunder, no nothing. How could it be a storm? Woman: I can't get a thing on the radio, not even the portable. The people began murmur softly in wonderment and question. Charlie: well, why don't you go downtown and check with the police? They'll probably think we're crazy or something. A little power failure and right away we get all flustered and everything. Steve: it isn't just a power failure, Charlie. If it was, we'd still be able to get broadcast and on the portable. There's a murmur of reaction to this. Steve looks from face to face and then over to his car. Steve: I'll run downtown. We'll get this all straightened out. He walks over to the car, gets in, turns the key. Beyond it, we see the crowd watching him from the other side. Steve starts the engine, turns over sluggishly, and then stops dead. He tries it again, and this time he can't get it to turn over. Then very slowly and reflectively, he turns the key back to off, and then slowly gets out of the car. As they stare at Steve, he stands for a moment by the car, then walks toward the group. Steve: I don't understand it. It was working fine before. John: out of gas? Steve shakes his head. I just had it filled up. Woman: what's it mean? Charlie: it's just as if everything had stopped. Then he turned towards Steve. We'd better walk downtown. Another murmur of assent at this. The two of us can go, Charlie. Steve. The two of us can go, Charlie. He turns to look back at the car. It couldn't be the meteor. A meteor couldn't do this. He and Charlie exchange a look, and then they start to walk away from the group. We see Tommy, a serious-faced 14-year-old in spectacles, who stands a few feet away from the group, halfway between them and the two men who start to walk down the sidewalk. Tommy: Mr. Brand, you better not. Steve: why not? Tommy: they don't want you to. Steve and Charlie exchange a grin, and Steve looks back at toward the boy. Steve: who doesn't want us to? Tommy jerks his head in the general direction of the distant horizon. Them. Steve: them? Charlie: who are them? Tommy, very intently: whoever was in that thing that came by overhead. Steve knits his brows for a moment, cocking his head questioningly. His voice is intense. Steve: what? Tommy: whoever was in that thing that came over? I don't think they want us to leave here. Steve leaves Charlie and walks over to the boy. He kneels down in front of him. He forces his voice to remain gentle. He reaches out and holds the boy. Steve: what do you mean? What are you talking about? Tommy: they don't want us to leave. That's why they shut everything off. Steve: what makes you say that? Whatever gave you that idea? Woman from the crowd: now isn't that the craziest thing you've ever heard? Tommy, persistently, but a little intimidated by the crowd: it's always that way in every story I've read about a ship landing from outer space. Woman to the boy's mother, Sally, who stands on the fringe of the crowd. From outer space. Yet. Sally, you better get that boy of yours up to bed. He's been reading too many comic books or seeing too many movies or something. Sally, Tommy, come over here and stop that kind of talk. Steve, go ahead, Tommy. We'll be right back. And you'll see that wasn't any ship or anything like it. That was just a meteor or something. Likely as not. He turns to the group, now trying to weight his words with an optimism he obviously doesn't feel, but is desperately trying to instill in himself as well as others. Steve, no doubt it has something to do with all this power failure and the rest of it. Meteors can do some crazy things, like sunspots. John, picking up the cue. Sure, that's the kind of thing like sunspots. They raise Cain with radio reception all over the world, and this thing being so close, why there's no telling that the sort of stuff it can do. He wets his lips, smiles nervously. Go ahead, Charlie. You and Steve go into town and see if it isn't what and see if that isn't what's causing it all. Steve and Charlie again walk away from the group down the sidewalk. The people watch silently. Tommy stares at them, biting his lips and finally calling out again. Tommy, Mr. Brand. The two men stop again. Tommy takes a step toward them. Tommy, Mr. Brand, please don't leave. Steve and Charlie can be seen beyond them. They stop once again and turn toward the boy. There's a murmur in the crowd, a murmur of irritation and concern as if the boy were bringing up fears that shouldn't be brought up. Words which carried with them a strange kind of validity that came without logic but nonetheless registered and had meaning and effect. Again, the murmur of reaction from the crowd. Tommy is partly frightened and partly defiant as well. Tommy, you might not even be able to get to town. It was that way in the story. Nobody could leave. Nobody except Steve. Except who? Tommy. Except the people they'd sent down ahead of them. They looked just like humans. And it wasn't until the ship landed that the boy suddenly stops again, conscious of the parents staring at them and of the sudden hush of the crowd. Sally, in whispers, sensing the antagonism of the crowd. Tommy, please, son, honey, don't talk that way. Man one, that kid shouldn't talk that way, and we shouldn't stand here listening to him. Why, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. The kid tells us a comic book plot, and here we stand listening. Steve walks towards the camera, stops by the boy. Steve, go ahead, Tommy. What kind of story was this? What about the people that they sent out ahead? Tommy, that was the way they prepared things for the landing. They sent 4 people, a mother and a father and 2 kids who looked just like humans, but they weren't. There's another silence as Steve looks toward the crowd and then towards Tommy. He wears a tight grin. Steve, well, I guess what we'd better do then is to run and check on the neighborhood and see which ones of us are really humans. There's laughter at this, but it's a laughter that comes from a desperate attempt to lighten the atmosphere. It's a release kind of laugh. The people look at one another in the middle of their laughter. Charlie, there must be something better to do than stand around making bum jokes about it, rubs his jaw nervously. I wonder if Laurel Street's got the same deal we got. He looks past the houses. Where's Pete Van Horn anyway? Didn't he get back yet? Suddenly there's a sound of a car's engine starting to turn over. Starting to turn over. We look across the street toward the driveway of Les Goodman's house. He's at the wheel trying to start the car. Sally, can you get it started, Les? Goodman, no dice. He walks toward the group. He stops suddenly as behind him. Inexplicably and with a noise that inserts itself into the silence, the car engine starts up all by itself. Goodman whirls around to stare toward it. The car idles roughly, smoke coming from the exhaust, the frame shaking. Goodman's eyes go wide and he runs over to his car. The people stare at the car. Man 1. He got the car started somehow. He got his car started. The people stare, somehow caught up by this revelation, and somehow illogically, wildly frightened. Woman. How come his car just up and started like that? Sally. All by itself? He wasn't anywhere near it. It started all by himself. Don approaches the group, stops a few feet away to look toward Goodman's car, and then back toward the group. Don. And he never did come out to look at that thing that flew overhead. He wasn't even interested. He turns to the faces in the group, his face taut and serious. Why didn't he come out with the rest of us to look? Charlie. He's always an oddball, him and his whole family, real oddball. Don. What do you say we ask him? The group suddenly starts toward the house. In this brief fraction of a moment, they take the first step toward performing a metamorphosis that changes people from a group into a mob. They begin to head purposely across the street toward the house at the end. Steve stands in front of them. For a moment, their fear almost turns their walk into a wild stampede. But Steve's voice, loud, incisive, and commanding, makes them stop. Steve, wait a minute. Let's not be a mob. The people stop as a group, seem to pause for a moment, and then much more quietly and slowly start to walk across the street. Goodman stands there alone facing the people. Goodman. I just don't understand it. I tried to start it and it wouldn't start. You saw me. All of you saw me. And now, just as suddenly as the engine started, it stops. And there's a long silence that is gradually intruded upon by frightened murmuring of the people. Goodman. I don't understand. I swear, I don't understand what's happening. Don. Maybe you better tell us. Nothing's working on the street. Nothing. No lights, no power, no radio. And then meaningfully. Nothing except one car. Yours. The people pick this up, and now their murmuring becomes loud, a loud chant filling the air with accusations and demand for action. Two of the men pass Don and head toward Goodman, who backs away, backing into his car and now at bay. Goodman. Wait a minute. You keep your distance, all of you. So I've got a car that starts by itself. Well, that's a freak thing. I admit it. But does that make me some kind of a criminal or something? I don't know why the car works. It just does. This stops the crowd momentarily, and now Goodman, still backing away, goes towards his front porch. He goes up the steps, then stops, standing, facing the mob. We see Steve as he comes through the crowd. Quietly. Steve, quietly. We're all on a monster kick, Les. Seems that the general impression holds that maybe one family isn't what we think they are. Monsters from outer space or something? Different than us? Fifth columnists from the vast beyond? He chuckles. You know anybody that might fit that description around here on Maple Street? Goodman. What is this, a gag or something? This is a practical joke or something. We see a close-up of a porch light and suddenly goes out. There's a murmur from the group. Goodman. Now, I suppose that's supposed to incriminate me? The light goes on and off. That really does it, doesn't it? He looks around the faces of the people. I just don't understand this. He wets his lips, looking from face to face. Look, you all know me. We've lived here 5 years, right in this house. We're no different than any of the rest of you. We're no different at all. Really, this whole thing is just weird. Woman. Well, if that's the case, Les Goodman, explain why. She suddenly stops. She stops suddenly, clamping her mouth shut. Goodman softly. Explain what? Steve interjecting. Look, let's forget about this. Charlie, overlapping him. Go ahead, let her talk. What about it? Explain what? Woman, a little reluctant. Well, sometimes I go to bed late at night. A couple of times I'd come out on the porch and I'd see Mr. Goodman here in the wee hours of the morning, standing out in front of his house, looking up at the sky. She looks around the circles of faces. That's right, looking up at the sky as if he were waiting for something. A pause, as if he were looking for something. There's a murmur of reaction from the crowd again as Goodman starts toward them. They back away, frightened. Goodman. You know, really, this is for laughs. You know what I'm guilty of? He laughs. I'm guilty of insomnia. Now what's the penalty of insomnia? At this point, the laugh, the humor, leaves his voice. Did you hear what I just said? I said it was insomnia. A pause as he looks around and shouts. I said it was insomnia. You fools. You're scared. Frightened rabbits, you. You're sick people. Do you know that? You're sick people, all of you. And you don't even know what you're starting because let me tell you, this thing you're starting that should frighten you, as God is my witness, you're letting something begin here. That's a nightmare. And that's the end of Act 1.